I'm June Gruber, an associate professor of psychology at the University of Colorado Boulder and director of the Mental Health Expert Series. I'm very delighted to be here today with Dr. Deanna Barch, chair and professor of psychological and brain sciences, professor of radiology, and the Gregory B. Couch professor of psychiatry at Washington University in St. Louis. So thanks for being here today, Deanna.
Thanks for having me, June.
I was wondering if we could start just by hearing a bit about the kind of work you've been doing in the mental health sciences with the focus on your work in motivation and psychosis.
Yeah, so I have long had a line of research focused on understanding the difficulties that individuals with psychosis have in their everyday lives and what are the sorts of things that constrain their ability to live independent lives and sort of constrains quality of life. And so that research is focused both on cognitive impairments and then also on motivational impairments. And I think that's been really interesting because what we know is that even when individuals with schizophrenia are taking medications or having treatments that help what we kind of typically think of as the symptoms of schizophrenia, like hallucinations and delusions, even when those things are better, due to their treatments, they often still have difficulties living independently, working, being able to follow treatment plans and so on. And so that's really led us to try to understand what it is that's kind of leading to those additional constraints so that we might be able to develop better treatments for that. And we definitely know from a wide body of research that individuals with schizophrenia and many other mental illnesses have difficulties with a number of different aspects of memory and thinking. But I think historically, we've assumed that people with schizophrenia also have something called anhedonia, or sometimes defined as the inability to experience pleasure. Because when you do clinical interviews with individuals with these illnesses, their descriptions make it sound as if they don't enjoy things, they're not looking forward to things, they're not sort of motivated to engage in activities that we normally would think us give us some pleasure or enjoyment or sense of achievement. But what's actually really interesting is when we started doing research on this, we found that that was true if you interviewed individuals sort of in your office or clinic about their lives outside of your research setting or outside of your office. But when you looked at what people were experiencing in the moment, we saw that individuals with schizophrenia really seemed to enjoy things as much in the moment, right? Whether that be social pleasures or food or drink or sort of achievements. But where the challenge seemed to be was in anticipating or looking forward to, or sort of, thinking into the future about things that they might find enjoyable or pleasurable, and using that information to sort of drive their ongoing behavior. And that sort of tied into the work that we were doing on cognition, which was also focusing on difficulties in sort of representing things in memory and being able to kind of like maintain goal representations over time. And so that led us to work starting to look at whether those kinds of difficulties, sort of representing things in the abstract or thinking about the future, might be making it seem like people with schizophrenia didn't enjoy things, when really it was about the ability to sort of anticipate those things ahead of time and use them to drive sort of motivated or goal focused behavior.
And how did you first go about getting started in this work?
So it's actually a funny story. So it sort of started way back when I graduated for college and took a year off to become a case manager for the chronically mentally ill. And one of the things I noticed in the clients with whom I was working was, this kind of like, challenges and sort of getting motivated to do things and looking forward to things and sort of anticipating things. And that kind of started to strike me even back then as something that was potentially constraining their lives and their quality of life. And so then when I went to graduate school, I went to graduate school at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, and I was really interested in anhedonia. And so my very first project in graduate school was trying to develop a way to measure anhedonia in kids. That actually didn't work very well. Wasn't a very good measure. And so I kind of said, oh, I'm going to focus on cognition instead. That's more straightforward to measure. Like we have a lot of tools. So I spent a bunch of time focusing on cognition. And then it kind of got us back interested in motivation. And it was a way to kind of start to tie those together. So it really did stem all the way back to sort of my clinical experience prior to going to get my graduate degree.
And when you kind of look back, what first got you interested in this work and where you are today, what are some notable, frustrations or failures along the way? But of course, also successes you've been able to savor.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I've been pretty fortunate, and I will say that is that I don't think I've had a tremendous number of frustrations, like really serious challenges, and I try to remember to really be thankful for that all the time. But I would say the example I gave is one where, in our first project in this area, we were trying to develop a new measure to measure anhedonia in kids, and it just didn't work, right? And it just flat out did not work. Um, and I think that can be really demoralizing. And I see that happen sometimes with my younger like trainees or mentees where maybe they spend a whole bunch of time generating this beautiful set of ideas and theories and hypotheses, and they develop an elegant test and then it just doesn't work, right? And that can be really frustrating, and especially if it's your first project because you haven't yet had experiences to tell you, yeah, you're going to have some positive outcomes, and that kind of helps you bridge over failures or frustrations. So I think perseverance and sort of sticking with it, and being able to go and talk to people who have also had projects that didn't work out, right? To kind of recognize like just because one project doesn't work out doesn't mean you're doomed to failure, right? um so that always kind of strikes me because it was such kind of a very early part of my career. I mean, successes, I would really say a lot of my successes have come from a willingness to sort of join new collaborations and to be sort of inclusive and thinking about how we can bring different perspectives together, to try to understand something that's sort of greater than the sum of the parts. So, even in my psychosis research, I've had a set of collaborators for God knows how many years now, 10, 12, 15 years across 5 different sites in the US. And we've done numerous projects together, collected data, collected imaging data. We have a grant that we're funded with right now. And it's really allowed me to do work that I wouldn't have been able to do in isolation, right? Like people bring these complementary skills to these collaborations that I think has allowed us to do work that none of us could have done individually. So I think, some of my biggest successes have really come out of finding really good collaborators and fun collaborators and smart collaborators, right? And being able to work with them.
I mean, as you talk about kind of, having fun, kind, smart collaborators and bridging across different sites to do projects that, no one lab could do on its own. What do you think about as you kind of move into the future and sort of think forward? What are some of the most important next steps in our field?
Well, I think some of the most important next steps in our field are to better understand how the things we study in the lab translate into everyday life.
Mhm.
Because I think you know, it's wonderful to do really clean, tight, organized experiments in the lab that we think tap into meaningful things. But at some point in time, we have to really start to ask, and how does this translate, right? Like, what does this mean for people's everyday life? If I look at pleasure and motivation in my lab, does that map to what people are experiencing in their everyday life? And starting to think about tools and methods that let us really bridge that sort of, controlled experimental methods that we can do in our research laboratories that really let us hone in on sort of particular mechanisms and theories with the sort of ecological validity of, okay, and then what does that mean for what people are actually doing in their everyday lives? And then what does that mean for intervention, right? Can we think about more so how some of these things, I mean, for myself, I'm like sort of a basic translational scientist. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about mechanisms and theories and causes. And as I get older, I start to think more about, okay, and then how do we translate those things that we're learning into things that might actually have a positive impact on people's lives? I'm not saying at all that we should stop doing the translational and basic science research. I think that is so core and fundamental, but I do think we have to put greater emphasis on tying it to everyday life experience.
So, in kind of the theme of tying things to everyday life experience, what advice would you have for those who might be watching this interview now? Students, maybe other mental health professionals, the public who are interested in this field.
Yeah, so I think, for good or for bad, there's still a lot of work to be done. And so there's much room for contributions and creativity. And so I would invite many people to join us. And there's contributions to be made both in the domains of more research on causes and consequences and treatment, but also in translating the things we have learned into ways that can help people. And so I think there's a lot of different ways people can get involved and engaged. I think for consumers and families of consumers, I think advocacy is really important. I think we still have a major issue in the world with the stigma associated with mental health challenges, and that there's still much work to be done in making sure that people have access to adequate care, that we have sufficient resources, that we have a lot of treatments for many things that have known benefits and they're not always available to people or people aren't always aware of them. So I think we still have a lot of work to do in that regard in terms of just making sure people know that they can access what we already have learned that is helpful, and then ways they can get involved to keep addressing the things that we still need to work on in terms of prevention and early intervention, ideally.
Well, thank you so much. Those are really inspiring answers, and it was just really motivating to hear kind of your trajectory of where you started and see all the accomplishments your career has had for you and your lab and your mentees now, and just as a role model for other women in science too. So thanks for speaking today.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.